Fellow Kenyans, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by wishing each and every one of you a happy Mashujaa Day. And let me also, at the very onset, thank you, the Abagusi, for the warm reception that we have received here in Kisii. To celebrate the cultural diversity of Kenya and to strengthen our nationhood, I made the decision to hold our national celebrations in the counties on a rotational basis. Today, Kisii joins the counties of Nakuru, Nyeri, Machakos, Meru, Kakamega, Narok, and Mombasa in having played host to a national celebration. And indeed, in the near future, we shall announce where next year's Madaraka Day will be hosted. So, fellow Kenyans, we gather here to celebrate 68 years of history and heroism as a country. We are well aware, indeed, as the former Prime Minister mentioned, that the Abagusi community is also not short of heroes. In their senior ranks, there are those that have been mentioned by the Prime Minister. You will also encounter senior chiefs, Angwenyi Geshana, Osongo Agwenyi, Oga Agwenyi, Zakaria Agwenyi, Musa Nyandusi, and many others. The makers of the Kenyan nation at independence also tapped into the abilities of your sons and daughters, heralding the birth of a strong and vibrant nation whose story cannot be complete without the mention of Lawrence Sagini, James Nyamweya, Zachary Onyonka, amongst others. And thereafter, following in the steps of the independence Abagusi heroes, many others heeded the call to serve the public arena, with some rising to high echelons of public service as high-standing cabinet ministers, formidable legislators, influential judicial figures, amongst them being George Museti Anyona, Simeon Nyachai, Justice Nyarangi, just to mention but a few. So, ladies and gentlemen, on this day in 1952, a state of emergency was declared in Kenya by the British. They arrested over 200 of our leaders, including the Kapenguria Six, and indeed started one of the darkest chapters in the history of our nation. The atrocities visited upon thousands of our people during the emergency period can never be described by any account of history. Even the secret histories of the hanged in detention camps cannot capture the pain of what was later called the Dirty War between the British and our liberation heroes. Fathers were taken away from their families never to return, while those who did limped back home, some having been castrated and permanently robbed of the joy of ever being a parent. Mothers were maimed by marauding soldiers never to recover, and innocent children were forcefully conscripted into a war and turned against their own. The darkness of this dirty war and its imprint on the psyche of our nation will remain alive in our memories forever. However, the founding father of our nation, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, advised us that for our country to heal and move forward, we must forgive, but we can never forget. This advice to forgive and not to forget was not a call to begrudge the perpetrators of the darkest part of our history. It was a call to remind our children about our past every Mashujaa Day, and to do it recognizing that liberation is a process. The more we ponder our history in its truest form, the more liberated we become. But those who whitewash and dodge their history become victims of its ugly parts. Fellow Kenyans, this day, the 20th of October, was set aside by our forefathers because there is no country without a history, and there is no history without heroes. The day was also set aside to remind us that history is not just about the past. Our history is also a torch that blazes a trail into the future as well. And that is why I invite you today to reflect with me on the heroes and heroines that defined our nationhood. Although we speak of October 1952 as the hallmark date in the history of our heroes, tales of heroism in Kenya date back to the 19th century, well over 100 years ago. And this is testament to the fact that our national pride is not a recent affair. It is something ingrained in our consciousness as a people. For instance, Chief Wayaki Wahinga led a resistance movement of the Agikuyu against the leadership of the British administration towards the end of the 19th century. His main complaint was that the colonizers were excessive in their demand for livestock and labor from his people. And during one of the disagreements, he is said to have burnt down a British establishment in his jurisdiction in 1890. 2 years later, in 1892, Wayaki Wahinga was arrested and buried alive at Manyani Maximum Prison in Taita Taveta. He died a hero. And today, I cannot be more proud than I was last week when in the same venue, Manyani, I introduced the future heroes of our nation, a group of 800 young men and women engaged in groundbreaking innovations for the future of our country. Another hero from this era was Mukile Wanameme, leader of the Bukusu resistance of 1895, a brave soldier and a skilled military man. Wanameme is said to have beaten the British soldiers in his first battle against them at Chitemba Hills near Webuye. He died a hero. And not all our 19th century heroes were men. There was a Giriama widow by the name of Mekatilili Wamenza, who distinguished herself as one of the foremost warriors of her time. Born in 1840, She led the Giriama resistance against the British Empire between 1912 and 1915. Her grievance against the British administration using forced Giriama labor that undignified her people. She was arrested twice, put in colonial maximum prisons, and in both instances escaped. The first, as we heard earlier, actually being here in Kisii, where she walked after escaping 800 kilometers back home. Her second escape was from Kismayo in present-day Somalia, and she did escape from there and went back to Kilifi to continue the Giriama resistance. Such spirit of resilience and constant comebacks is what we have banked in our historical records as heroism. A new generation of liberation leaders, inspired by these 19th century heroes, emerged from the 1920s. They included, amongst others, Jomo Kenyatta, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Harry Thuku, Achieng' Oneko, Daniel Arap Moi, Masinde Muliro, amongst others. This generation was more enlightened in Western tactics and began to use pen and paper to advance the cause of the African people. This is the generation that laid the foundation stone for our modern nation state, and that is why we call them the founding fathers of this nation. In the late 1940s, a new generation who had fought side by side with British soldiers during the Second World War emerged. This generation was heroic on many accounts. They fought the Mau Mau War against the British Empire and won. And thereafter, together with the founding fathers, they negotiated and drafted our constituting instruments for the birth of a new nation, and fundamentally, they started the journey of founding our nationhood from scratch. But what enduring lessons can we highlight as a nation from the examples of these ordinary men and women who became heroes? What must we teach our children every Mashujaa Day from the acts of these heroes? These liberation heroes were people who sacrificed themselves for an ideal bigger than themselves. These heroes, some of them buried in unmarked graves, understood that there is no weapon more lethal than the will of a free people. They sacrificed for this high ideal, negotiated when they had to, but they never surrendered. Their resolve remained unbroken and unbowed. Some historians have argued that these heroes were extraordinary people, but nothing can be further from the truth. These veterans were ordinary people who became extraordinary because of the choices they made. They did not start out as heroes who did big things. Their heroism was only revealed as they stubbornly confronted obstacles that stood in their path to freedom. They only became heroes moment by moment as the liberation of our country from the shackles of colonialism unfolded. So, fellow Kenyans, you may ask why I just said that creating our nationhood is a journey started by our founding fathers, but one that is yet to be completed. I say so, fellow Kenyans, because nationhood is not an event. It is a process. When our founding fathers emerged from the liberation war with fresh wounds, bloodied faces, years of incarceration, they had only one desire. They had vanquished their enemy and brought freedom. But the task of bringing 42 nations into a single nation state was still daunting. They knew that this would be a journey. They knew that summoning the consciousness of 42 nations into a singular purpose under the nation state would take constant negotiations and renegotiations. And borrowing from their own historical experiences, the process of constantly reviewing our nationhood would only happen through the unremitting search for a constitutional consensus. This position was strongly advocated by another group of our heroes known as the constitutionalists. Apart from being the architects of our new state and the engineers of our new economic order, they pushed for the practice of constantly building a constitutional consensus. To them, constitution making was not a rigid endpoint. It was a constantly moving target that requires continuous consensus. More so, because they saw constitution making as being a process first and then an act after. While the act of constitution making is an end state in itself, the process is a constant negotiation and renegotiation of nationhood. Guided by this philosophy of constitutional consensus, these heroes went through as many as 4 constitutions before landing on a workable consensus. And their mantra in this search was best captured by the former Vice President, Joseph Murumbi, when he said, and I quote, "There is nothing wrong with Kenya that cannot be fixed by what is right with Kenya." End of quote. If the Littleton Constitution of 1954 was wrong, it was made right by the Lennox-Boyd Constitution of 1958. When this constitution outlived its consensus, the Ian MacLeod Constitution of 1960 kicked in, and the search for a common ground continued until the Independence Constitution was adopted. But even then, this constitution was adopted as a ceasefire document to facilitate independence. After independence, the Lancaster Consensus was replaced by a new consensus, and the cycle of constantly negotiating our nationhood continued. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I cautioned against constitutional rigidity in my Madaraka Day address this year, this is exactly what I meant. Our founding fathers and our constitutional heroes did not intend our constitutional order to enslave us. They constructed it to serve us. And when it ceased to serve us, we are meant to borrow from the examples of our founding fathers and rethink it. More so, if the national question of the day requires a constitutional settlement. Fellow Kenyans, our country at a constitutional moment. And the national question goes back to the advent of our multi-party system. For indeed, it was after the reintroduction of political pluralism in 1992 that negative politics began to dominate our national arena. The question at hand, and one requiring a constitutional consensus, is therefore, how do we as a people, as a nation, resolve the winner-take-all situation within a context of competitive politics as required by democratic practice? And how do we ensure we fulfill our democratic credentials without tearing apart the diversity of our nation? The question of us versus them must come to an end, fellow Kenyans. And as we exercise our democratic rights, it must never again be at the expense of our diversity. The cardinal principle must always be our unity in diversity. Yes, the 2010 Constitution gave us some remedies, but did it resolve or entrench the zero-sum game in which the winner takes all and the loser goes home with nothing? Are we still in this zero-sum constitutional dispensation that created conflict since the advent of multi-party politics in 1992? And how do we expect as a people to resolve this problem using elections instead of constitutional change? It would indeed, fellow Kenyans, be a tragedy if come subsequent elections we have not resolved this dilemma. And that is why I urge the country to ponder a constitutional consensus around a three-pronged national question. On the one part, the question is political inclusion. Instead of a zero-sum constitutional equation, can we adopt a positive-sum equation? Can we adopt a constitutional arrangement that can take care of our diversity as a people? And on this, fellow Kenyans, we should not give my suggestion the parochial interpretation of creating positions for individuals. I am only urging for a constitutional consensus that accommodates all communities in an election. A consensus that makes it possible for any Kenyan to lead this country working hand in hand with his or her brothers and sisters from across the nation. The second part of the national question at hand is about equity in the distribution of opportunities and resources. Our political practice, unfortunately, has been such that resources and opportunity go to those occupying positions of authority. And that is why elections are so divisive and emotive. But it is possible for us to entrench the principles of equity in the distribution of resources and opportunities in the Constitution. This way, it is the Constitution, not individuals, who will guarantee that no one is excluded or left behind. The third part of the national question speaks to the contestations and violence every electoral cycle. 1 year before every election, the economy shuts down as it anticipates the turns and twists of the election. 1 year after the election, the economy is still on a go-slow as markets wrap themselves around the emerging political constellations. This means that in every electoral cycle of 5 years, 2 years are wasted exclusively attending to electoral matters. Fellow Kenyans, the quest to liberate our land was also fueled by our desire to drive hunger, ignorance, disease, and unemployment from our midst. Unless the economy is sustainably expanding to accommodate the youth graduating every year, then what we are doing by removing 2 years is robbing our children of their future. Therefore, as part of the national question, we are called to create an environment where enterprise can thrive by continuously attracting capital into the country. Endless political contestations creates anxiety, akin to some of the things that we are witnessing in our nation today. Truly, I do not believe that is what our founding fathers and the constitutionalists at independence wanted for us. And if we do not change it now, when we have this constitutional moment, this problem will plague our country for years on end. My invitation to our country, therefore, is for us to have an honest conversation with itself, as William has just said. And we must not shy away from taking bold decisions the way our founding fathers did. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to continue by saying that we cannot talk of our independence heroes without mentoring the diaspora fraternity that also supported our liberation struggle, and yet they were not Kenyans. The former Prime Minister of India, the late Jawaharlal Nehru, was one of the very early supporters of our struggle. When the Kapenguria Sikhs were put on trial, he provided part of the legal team that defended them. His rationale was that the liberation struggle anywhere in the colonies was a struggle to liberate the human spirit first and to gain self-rule second. The other diaspora heroes of our liberation included the leadership of the Pan-Africanist movement. And indeed, this week marks the 75th year since the 5th Pan-African Conference was held in Manchester between the 16th to the 21st of October 1945. In attendance were men like W.E.B. Du Bois, who presided over the sessions, men like George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Ras Makonnen, Wallace Johnson, C.L.R. James, and Jomo Kenyatta. This conference pledged to support the liberation movement in Kenya, and indeed they stayed the course. The spirit of Pan-Africanism, imagination, brotherhood without borders, and the craving for an African renaissance is one we need to recapture as we celebrate our diaspora heroes today. We must remember that our founding fathers were Pan-Africanists, and to uphold their vision we must support the African dream of working together, living together, and building the unity of the African continent. Fellow Kenyans, we must also celebrate today our young people. They are our heroes, and yet we so often forget. As one statesman once said, and I quote, "We do not own this country. We have just borrowed it from our children, as represented by our young people." And if history is not just a path to the past, but a trail into the future, then a spotlight must be shone on our young people this Mashujaa Day. I remind you all that the makers of this nation were actually dominated by young people who worked closely with a few elder statesmen. Many do not know that the Independence Cabinet and the new administration was also dominated by young people. Many also do not realize that the first draft of sessional paper number 10 of 1965, which became the blueprint vision of our economy, was written by a 29-year-old technocrat known as Japheth Shamala. These young men were not extraordinary. They became our independence heroes because they made more opportunities out of the little they had been given. Instead of focusing on the hardships of building a new nation from ground up, they focused on the possibilities. The Independence War had taught them that energy flows where attention goes. They had learned from the struggle that what you focus on grows, and the words you utter become flesh. Our young liberators became heroes because they focused on what could be done and not the obstacles that stood in their way. Their attention was on the positive, and the words they uttered about their country were full of optimism. This attitude of positive energy made most of them heroes because they dared to do the impossible. And here is a lesson to our young people today. As I said in my Madaraka Day address, our nation, Kenya, is still a work in progress. It has its good and its bad. It has its ugly, but it also has its sweet. If our attention as a people and a nation always reverts to the bad and the ugly, all energy will flow to the negative, and we will just become a nation of angry, disillusioned people. But the young people who embrace the positive and the possible will emerge heroes and makers of things. So therefore, a good starting point for all our young people is to look for a problem and solve it. And if you solve a problem, heroism and success will naturally follow you. And I have 3 recent examples to illustrate this here in Kenya. The first one, last week on Friday, I invited my cabinet and indeed the entire nation as I unveiled a series of transformative programs and projects undertaken by our young people. The team of over 800 young men and women drawn from across the Republic have undertaken seminal programs that include the nationwide airborne geophysical survey, the geospatial project, the cyber project, developed drones, as well as a national security industrial project. These young innovators not only delivered high-quality work, they also did so at a fraction of the said cost. For example, ladies and gentlemen, in respect to the mapping of our national resources under the National Airborne Geophysical Survey, a private firm had quoted to do this at a cost of Kenya shillings 30 billion. But our team of young professionals have programmed to do the job at a cost of Kenya shillings 4 billion. Currently, this project is almost 70% complete, and we look forward next year to launching it. With the completion of this seminal project, the comprehensive geology of our country is now known, and that information will be used to chart a path to prosperity and self-sufficiency for host communities and the wider Kenyan nation. Our young people have similarly completed the mapping of our entire country to the sublocation level, an endeavor that was last undertaken in 1972. Thanks to their efforts, we now have an annotated inventory of all public utilities across the country, all public infrastructure, all schools, both public and private, all hospitals, and all other public utilities, and a description of all physical developments, all the way to the individual home. Mambo ya kuiba mali ya serikali sasa itakuwa ngumu sana. Because of this, the next frontier of e-commerce within our nation will be powered by the national address system that will be rolled out across our nation. The e-commerce trade channel will be serviced with drones made by Kenyans for Kenyans. The second example I want to give is about two engineering students from Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. The two, Michael Mwasikenyi and Ken Geshira, created an automated weeding robot to help farmers eliminate the need for herbicides in their crops. The robot uses artificial intelligence to discriminate between weeds and crops, and the innovation has a robotic arm for weeding in between the crop rows and a plow-like weeding tool that is dragged by the robot as it passes in between the rows of crops to remove inter-row weeds. This innovation emerged winner of the 2020 Imagine Cup, beating teams from across 9 European, Middle Eastern, and African countries. The innovation is scheduled for presentation at the Imagine World Championship in Seattle, Washington State. Added to the many innovations from our young people during the COVID-19 crisis, the third heroic example I wish to mention is that of one Roy Alela, holder of a bachelor's degree in microprocessor technology and instrumentation from the University of Nairobi. This 25-year-old engineer had a strong urge to communicate with his 6-year-old niece, 6-year-old deaf niece. He had a problem to solve, and he did not shy away from it. After many experiments, he finally managed to create a pair of smart gloves that helped him communicate with his deaf niece. These gloves have flex sensors that help the deaf wearer communicate and actually vocalize messages to a mobile phone through Bluetooth. These customs are made to be customized to any client specifications and have a 93% accuracy of vocalizing messages. By solving the problem of his 6-year-old niece, Roy Alela has created a solution that will help thousands of deaf people globally. This innovation has won the Hardware Trailblazer Award by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. Roy was also the second runner-up for the British Royal Academy of Engineering Leaders in Innovation. With the example, therefore, of the National Security Program, Weeding Robot, and the Smart Glove, it is clear that Kenya has a pool of talented and gifted people. Where those transformative innovations came from, I believe there are many more. All we need do is look. And if our national attention moves to the search for solutions, our natural energy will indeed flow to a positive place. Fellow Kenyans, allow me to end my address today by recording 2 Mashujaa lessons from our founding fathers to our young people. I am compelled to do this because one statement said, if it was not for the elders correcting the mistakes of the young, there would be no state. My intention today is not to correct, but to point our young people in a direction that will make them heroes in their times. The first lesson from our liberation heroes is that it's got to be me. It's got to be me, and it's got to be me. That is, if anything will happen, it all depends on me. If change will happen, do not expect your neighbors to be the one to cause it. You are the one to do it. Answer the summons of change and be the driver of that change. All you need do is show up at the arena. Theodore Roosevelt once said that the man who matters is not the man who stands by the wayside criticizing, saying how things could have been done better. The man who matters is the one in the arena, the man whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, the man who errs and comes short again and again, knowing that even if he fails, at least he fails trying. My call to our young people, therefore, is to get off the wayside of pessimism and get into the arena. If the young veterans of war had not heeded the summons of change, we would not be having this Mashujaa Day or the independence that we enjoy today. The second lesson to our young people from the liberation heroes is this: be prepared to pay the price. And I'm using the word price to mean what you pay in exchange for something. The price of our liberation was high, but there was no doubt that our founding fathers were prepared to pay for it. Some of them paid the price with their own lives, but what they got in exchange is far greater than they could ever have imagined. Borrowing from the young veterans of our liberation, my appeal to our young people is not to be afraid of paying the price. If you have a dream, pay the price and the dream will come to you. And if you have a challenge, pay the price and it will resolve itself. And in saying this, I am inspired by the words of Reverend Frederick Donaldson in a sermon he gave almost 100 years ago. In this sermon, he dreaded an emerging culture of not paying the price. A culture characterized by wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, science without humanity, worship without sacrifice, and politics without principle. If indeed our founding fathers were young people when they created Kenya, our young people can found a new Kenya in our lifetime. They have what it takes to create a new wave of heroism if they get into the arena prepared to pay the price of dreaming. On my part as your president, I will continue to accord our youth every opportunity to serve in public service. Indeed, the last crop of chief administrative secretaries that I appointed, the vast majority of appointees were in their 20s and 30s. A continuation of my promise to the youth that my government will empower them and give them a greater voice. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also take this opportunity to commend all the young people that are serving their nation, both at national and county level. Our national response to the coronavirus pandemic was fortified by their immense contributions. I also want to thank our valiant, critical, and essential service providers for keeping Kenya going through this difficult time. I also thank our healthcare workers for their heroism, dedication, and selflessness in the midst of the greatest threat to public health in a century. I thank, too, our law enforcement officers, our military, who are keeping Kenyans safe and orderly. Fellow Kenyans, what then is our lesson from our independence heroes this Mashujaa Day? What our heroes taught us is that it is very easy to lose a country. And as your fourth president, I need to remind you that you will have a fifth, a sixth, and even a 10th president, but you have only one Kenya. This is all we have, and it is imperative that we all must protect it at any cost. So, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot conclude this address without honoring our COVID-19 heroes. In particular, I want to give special mention to our departed health workers, such as Dr. Doreen Lugliki of Nairobi South Hospital, Clifford Mburia of Kitengela Medical Center, Moses Ringera of the University of Nairobi Health Services, Marian Awar of Rachuonyo Hospital, amongst others. Their memory will forever be engraved on our hearts. These brave souls paid the ultimate price, and like our founding fathers, they teach us that heroes are ordinary people who are made extraordinary by unusual circumstances. Similarly, and given the fear-ridden circumstances our COVID-19 heroes found themselves in, they teach us that heroism is not the absence of fear, it is the conquest of fear. On this day, we are called on to embrace the challenges of our times with courage and fortitude, and to seize the constitutional moment to redefine our future and our shared prosperity. And in so doing, we will live to the call of our founding fathers when they secured our independence. I thank you. Mungu awabariki, Mungu awalinde, Mungu alinde taifa letu la Kenya. Asanteni sana.
Tusimameni sote kwa wimbo wa taifa tafadhali.
Asante, niombe tuketi kwa kifupi. Na kabla ya wimbo wa taifa, Mheshimiwa Rais, naomba kwa heshima uniruhusu nimwite mwenyekiti wa kitaifa wa kamati inayoshughulikia masuala ya National Integrated Identity Management System NIMS, Waziri Dr. Fred Matiang'i, atuongoze kwa kipindi kifupi. Waziri, karibu.
Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Kenya Defense Forces, Your Excellency, the First Lady, Your Excellency, the Deputy President, and Mashujaa Ruto, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, with your kind indulgence, may I invite the Honorable the Attorney General to join me as we perform this very simple and short ceremony. Your Excellency, about just over 2 years ago, under the National Security Project, you directed that we commence the National Integrated Identity Management System. The focus has been explained several times before in several occasions. It's intended to basically integrate public personal data so that every Kenyan gets a single identity we call a single source of truth, or in Kiswahili, huduma number. Your Excellency, it's my pleasure now on behalf of my colleagues in the Interministerial Committee to report on this historic day that the process is now complete and we have actually developed the huduma number. Your Excellency, today, you and the First Lady will be the first recipients of the Sambo Huduma card, which we hope to be rolled out as soon as the National Assembly completes the process of the appointment of the Data Commissioner as directed by the High Court. Your Excellency, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues in the committee, I would like to invite the Honorable the Attorney General to now hand over the Sambo Huduma card to you and to Her Excellency the First Lady. And thereafter, Your Excellency, I request you to hand out 10 Sambo Huduma cards for validation to 10 individuals and therefore guide us on the rollout that will begin strictly in compliance with the directions of the High Court as soon as the National Assembly is done with the process of the appointment of the Data Commissioner. Your Excellency, the President.
There we have it, huduma number for His Excellency the President and Her Excellency the First Lady. Asante. There we have it. Tuombe sasa Mheshimiwa Rais uweze kupeana ya kwanza kwa Laban Uhuru Siro. Tumlete kwa haraka. Laban Evans Amenya Bosire. Alois Mosoti Okero. Sylvester Achuka Mose. Boniface Moseti Oyaro. Evans Guaro Nchoga. Kevin Bwire Mubandi. Lawrence Nyanuga Omambia, Evans Michael Mose, na wa mwisho Henry Lerioka Nyabuto Deri. Asante.
Asanteni, nilikuwa tu nataka niongeze tu mambo machache, tafadhali kama mnaweza mketi dakika moja. Mwajua tulianza kazi ya kuhakikisha kila Mkenya ataweza kupata huduma namba yake ambayo itarahisisha vile Mkenya ataweza kupata huduma za serikali kwa njia rahisi. Na vile nilisema wakati tulikuwa kule Manyani, vijana wetu wamekuwa wakifanya kazi kwa bidii na tayari sasa wamemaliza shughuli zao, na sisi kama serikali tuko tayari kuanza sasa kupatia Wakenya kadi zao za huduma, na ndio waweze kupata hizo huduma zao either online kwa njia rahisi, na ile laini kubwa tulikuwa tunapanga kila wakati katika maofisi ya serikali iishe, badala ya masaa ya kupanga laini mtu akitafuta huduma awe anaendelea na biashara yake, anafanya mambo yake pahali alipo na anapata huduma yake kupitia hiyo kadi. Hiyo na kurahisisha huduma kwa wananchi ndio ilitusababisha tufanye hivi. Kwa hivyo leo mumeona nimewaonesha yangu, na zingine vile tumesema ni sample. Sisi Bwana Speaker, tunagojea sasa nyinyi mumalize kazi yenu. Jameni, mumalize kazi yenu na ndio Wakenya waweze kufurahia hali yao. Jameni, au ni namna gani? Wanakemunya. Na ningependa tafadhali wajumbe wote wasimame. Tuko na viongozi kwanza. Unajua kuna order. Kiongozi wa walio wengi kule bungeni, National Assembly, Bwana Kemunya. Kiongozi ya walio wengi katika Senate, Bwana Pogisho. Mdogo wa kiongozi ya walio wengi, Mheshimiwa Jimmy Angwenyi, mtoto wa kwenu. Mheshimiwa James Orengo, kiongozi wa minority. Mheshimiwa Junet, Chief Whip wa minority. Mheshimiwa Ongeri, ndio ambaye I think ndio Public Accounts Chairman, yeye ndio anahakikisha ya kwamba hatuibi pesa. Na hawa wengine nafikiri msalimiane tu, na asante kwa kuja kusherehekea pamoja na sisi. Ningependa pia kuchukua nafasi hii kurecognize viongozi wenzangu kutoka na viongozi wa vyama mbalimbali wenzangu ambao wako hapa. Tuko hapa na ndugu Stephen Kalonzo Musyoka, na yeye ndio kiongozi wa chama cha Wiper. Tuko hapa na ndugu Musalia Mudavadi, yeye ndio kiongozi wa ANC. Tuko hapa na ndugu Moses Wetangula, kiongozi wa Ford Kenya. Na hii ndio tunataka jameni. Kenya ni yetu sisi wote. Tupendane, tushirikiane. Kushindana sio wadui. Matusi haijengi. Tutafutiana, tunaweza, we can differ in terms of policies, in terms of programs. That is fine. But we don't have to differ to the point where we insult one another, where we shed blood of our own brothers and sisters because of what we want. No, we are here to serve. We are here to work together. We are here to respect one another. And if we respect each other, you will also be respected. So I want to say I am truly grateful. Nimefurahi sana kuwaona hapa mkija kuungana pamoja nasi na Wakenya wote pahali popote walipo kusherehekea siku hii ya mashujaa, na mimi natarajia kuendelea kufanya kazi pamoja nanyi na viongozi wote kwa niaba ya wananchi milioni 45 wa Kenya wazalendo. Nasema Mungu awabariki, Mungu awalinde, na tuendelee na umoja na amani katika taifa letu la Kenya. Asanteni sana. Thank you.
Asante sana Mheshimiwa Rais. Naomba sote kwa heshima tusimame kwa wimbo wa taifa. Kidogo tafadhali, kidogo.
Sorry. Nimefanya makosa na sasa hiyo mambo ya huduma yangu inaweza kuanguka kwa sababu nimesahau kutaja hapa tuko na kiongozi wa one of the arms of government which is the judiciary, ndio yuko hapa, Chief Justice wetu, tuko pamoja naye hapa. Asante sana Chief Justice. Tuko hapa na Speaker wa the National Assembly Bwana Justin Muturi, uko hapa. Tuko hapa na Speaker wa Senate, na yeye pia tuko naye hapa. Sasa mtapitisha, si ndio? Asante sana.
Wimbo wa taifa. Asanteni sana. Kwa ruhusa ya Mheshimiwa Rais, nitaomba sote tulio kwenye jukwaa rasmi tutatulia as I announce the departure protocol. Tutamkubalia Mheshimiwa Rais Uhuru Kenyatta na the First Lady wataondoka kwanza, kisha basi nitaeleza. Wengine situlie tafadhali. We would wish to observe departure protocols being led by His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya and Her Excellency the First Lady. Watafuatwa na Mheshimiwa Naibu wa Rais na BBI Ruto. Wengine tutatulia tafadhali so that we observe departure protocols. Atafuata Speaker wa Bunge la Kitaifa, Speaker wa Seneti, Honorable Chief Justice, the former Prime Minister, Head of Public Service, the Cabinet Secretary Interior, Cabinet Secretary Defense, Chief of Defense Forces and their servicemen, and the service commanders, Governor of Kitui County, Kisii County, ambassadors and high commissioners, cabinet secretaries, principal secretaries, the rest of us to remain kindly as you observe the departure protocol. His Excellency the President and Her Excellency the First Lady. Kindly, the rest of us will remain calm so that you observe departure protocol. Mheshimiwa Rais ataondoka na Mheshimiwa Mama Taifa. Atafuatwa na Mheshimiwa Naibu wa Rais na Mheshimiwa BBI Ruto. Speaker wa Bunge la Kitaifa atafuata Speaker wa Seneti, aliyekuwa Waziri Mkuu, Head of Public Service, Cabinet Secretary Interior, Cabinet Secretary Defense, Chief of Defense Forces, ataondoka Mheshimiwa Rais kwa hiari yake pamoja na mama taifa. Tumpongeze Mheshimiwa Rais anapoondoka. Asante sana, asante. Atafuatwa na naibu wa rais. Naibu wa rais Mheshimiwa Daktari William Ruto na Birecho Ruto. Speaker wa bunge la kitaifa atafuata, the Speaker of the National Assembly. Speaker of the Senate atafuata. Chief Justice atafuata. The former Prime Minister. Asante sana, tumpongeze naibu wa rais anapoondoka Mheshimiwa Daktari William Ruto. The Speaker of the National Assembly, Speaker wa bunge la kitaifa, Speaker wa Seneti, the Chief Justice,
Kenya ni nchi yangu, Kenya naipenda.
Speaker of the National Assembly atafuata.
Mashariki hadi magharibi, kote ni kuzuri. Tuna mimea mbalimbali hapa kwetu Kenya.